Hi everyone, it's 1st of July, so happy Canada Day to everyone. So we're nearing the end of the course, we have 2 weeks left, and in this week 9, I hope you can engage in some more conversations. And this time, after having looked at leadership, I'd like you to look at the process of management of change. So both these conversations are there not just to obviously get you to post and towards assignment 3 if you have conversations that you want assessed, but also to get you to exchange and interact and use that material towards your assignment, because it's going to be quite crucial in your final assignment. So today we're going to look at the process management of change. I have 3 specific aims to have a quick look at the process of management of change. What I've done is I've summarized some of the essential points from the literature in a very wide overview so that you have a clear idea as you go into it. The sort of things that I've mentioned in the literature on process of management of change, very sort of generic things in a way, but that you need to be aware of. Then I'd like you, obviously, during conversations this week, to look at the process of management of change as it relates to technology integration and TMEs, and then to begin your reflection towards your final assessment. So try and use all this discussion that you're having in this reflection in a case study that you've prepared for your personal assessment assignment. So management of change, some general remarks as we start. It's not simple, and I think you've started to see this when you started looking at the multiple stakeholders, and some of you in your team presentations have also started looking at models for the process management of change. So I invite you to go back into these presentations and go back to what has already been discussed. In industry, this has been looked at extensively, and I would say it's maybe a bit sad, but in education we're coming to this late. We've been shy when it comes to borrowing things from the field of management, and we've tended to reinvent the wheel, which means we're a few decades behind. So I would encourage you to really explore at will the literature in industry, in HR, in management, and to look at the sort of theories that are there and the models that are there that we can import and transfer very quickly to the field of education. Management of change needs to be proactively planned. That's really the basic conclusions that we have when we look at this literature. The potential for resistance needs to be identified and addressed, and the process needs nurturing, monitoring, and requires evaluation right throughout. And that's probably what's missing. And I would say generally, if you look at education, the way we've introduced abrupt changes, such as the need for inclusive provisions, even to some extent now when we're talking about the TRC recommendations, any drastic change that we've seen, or curriculum changes as well when they're introduced, we're not great in the field of education at doing all the process that I've just described. So this is going to be one of the problems with technology integration, definitely. So one of the important things when you're looking at management of change is to look at factors of resistance, because that's what the lessons we've learned from the field of industry. If you look at HR, if you look at organizational psych, or if you look at management, is that our natural human nature is to resist change. And literature has identified 3 reasons why we resist change, and I've listed them for you. So you'll see in the literature, and sometimes it's described in different, using different terminology, but basically it always comes back to this sort of 3 distinction or 3 categories of factors of resistance. So the first ones are psychological factors of resistance. Then we also often have a whole category that's called philosophical factors of resistance. And then we have factors of resistance relating to the format of the process of change itself, for relating to the specific decisions you've made in terms of format and time frame. So whichever of these categories you're faced with in your own case study, for example, it'll be important that you plan proactively addressing these before you start the process of change, and then monitoring them right through. So now I'm going to take them one at a time to just elucidate them a little bit, but I think they're fairly straightforward. So psychological factors of resistance, those are factors of resistance that, and there's a multitude of them, but what they have in common is that they relate back to the fears that the person has as they embark in the process of change. So your employees or your teachers, your staff may have fears about themselves and how the factors of the process of change you're putting forward is going to affect them personally. So I've listed a few there, but fear of the unknown, fear of losing a feeling of competency. This is going to be very prevalent in technology, because we are not always, we have sometimes a feeling very sort of explicitly formatted that we feel that because we're not in full mastery of technology, we're going to lose a sense of competency in the classroom. Fear of loss of status, if we're not an expert. So the fact that we're not an expert means we don't want to venture there because we feel we'll lose status. And we've identified lots of other fears in terms of classroom management, control. What if the students do things that we don't want them to do, and also lots of these fears. So I'll let you explore that and see how that category of fears of factors of resistance, which are psychological, affects your plans. And it is, as with each of the three categories, important that you identify these factors before you start, and that you monitor them throughout, and that you find specific ways of addressing that. In terms of psychological factors of resistance, it's usually reassurance. So really the art of management and the art of mastering this process of process management of change in the relations to psychological factors of resistance lies all in hand-holding, in actually preparing people for the change, making them see that they're dealing with myth rather than with genuine fears, and showing them the way forward so that they can address these fears and these anxieties before they even engage in the process. The second one is philosophical, and that's much more delicate. That really means that people who are suffering from this or experiencing this factor of resistance are people who are not convinced with the direction in which you're going. So they really have philosophical opposition to the direction of the change. And that's a lot harder to address and to monitor. So you see this kind of change in a lot of environments. But I'll give you an example. For example, we see it at the moment in terms of inclusion. When you're trying to shift schools toward inclusive practices, you do have a percentage of staff and of stakeholders who are going to say that they're not fully invested in inclusion. They don't completely believe in it. So you see, this is different. It's not a psychological fear that relates to them, but it's really the fact that they disagree with the direction that you're showing as a leader. So how do you address that? Well, that can be, and in technology, I think you're definitely going to hit some of this resistance in the process that you put forward. Obviously, information, obviously getting people to buy into the objective that you're fixing that's where the art's going to lie. It's going to be much more conceptual. It's going to be about preparing sort of communication strategy that means that you can get people on board with your objectives before you even move forward. Now, I think in this category, you will find people who may not react to whatever steps you're putting forward. I'm generalizing here, but in management and in leadership, you often hear people talk about the 20-60-20 when they talk about process management of change. And they mean that in most organizations, if we generalize, you will see 20% of people who are already on board with what you're putting forward. You've got about 60% who are indifferent and ambivalent, and it could go both ways. And so there's a lot of work to do with them in communication strategy, in getting them to adhere with your goal and your vision. And then you have a 20% who are not going to get on board whatever you do. And the realistic rule in most of the management literature that you will see is to focus on the 60 and not on the 20, because you have a great deal you can do with a 60 that is still ambivalent with regards to the objective that you set yourself. But you don't have that much, you may not have that much success with the 20% that is probably digging the hills and will actually continue to be resistant to your change on a basis of from a philosophical perspective, because they disagree with the objectives that you set yourself. In technology, it may well be that you have to prepare yourself for people who will not be swayed, even though you prepare the best communication strategy possible and you work with them. But keep those numbers in mind, because they're important how realistic our process is. The last factors of resistance are factors of resistance that relate to the process that you're putting forward itself. So usually they have to do with the speed and format. So people are not afraid or don't harbor particular fears with regards to the process itself in terms of personal sort of image and self-image. They don't necessarily have opposition to the direction you're taking or the vision or the goal you have, but they disagree with the way you're putting the change forward. So mostly it's in terms of which model of change have you chosen and which time frame you've chosen. People may feel they're hurried or that you're too slow, and vice versa. In terms of format of change, so you've got some classic models there, which I've listed: pilot project, parallel change, overnight change, progressive change. So pilot project, I think it's sort of self-explanatory. You are starting with a project and you're growing from there. Parallel change could be, for example, when you're applying your change to certain grades but not other, or a section of your school but not the others, and then you're hoping that you reap the benefits from that first sort of phase of change, and then you use that as a motivator for the second phase. Overnight change, unfortunately, is what we see a lot in education, is when policy is passed, that suddenly from one day to the other, we are embarking with the whole establishment, the whole organization in a different direction, and we hope that it will work. And progressive change is a change that is phased and scaled. That may be attractive, but it has its problems too. So I think I've done a pro and con, quickly pros and cons. Progressive change, fewer risk, obviously, easier to get people on board. You have less factors of resistance because people are not don't have the feeling they're rushed into things, but you may have problems getting to completion because people will have lots of opportunities to change their mind and to build other sorts of resistance along the way. You also have to get time frame. Progressive change for some of the large organizations that we're talking about in terms of school boards, it may be reliant on people who are not there forever, and so they have to actually make that change happen fairly quickly. And progressive change sometimes can stall because the people who have triggered the change have to go, and the time frame just wasn't long enough. So it definitely has its problem. Pilot project is always tempting. Sometimes problematic in schools because you are quickly hitting the issue of inequities. If you're giving certain technological equipment, for example, to one class, not the others, to one grade, not the others, to one section of your school, not the others, you are very quickly opening yourself to possibly human rights complaints, all sorts of issues with regards to inequities, complaints that may actually stand, because we are supposed to provide the same service to all of our students and all of our citizens. Parallel change, easier to monitor, but difficult to shift to wider scale. People often think this will be easier, but there's the definite problem of possibly getting stuck with part of the organization having successfully operated change and then still not finding enough motivation and support to be able to go on to the next. And this is really the worst case scenario, when then you end up with a sort of split organization where part of it has operated change, the other hasn't. And again, here there's a problem with equity. Parallel change I've seen happen, for example, in bilingual schools where I've worked, has been to say, right, the English-speaking side is going through the change because it's smaller, and the French-speaking side will go on later. And then there's definitely complaints and issues with regards to why are certain students and certain part of your population allowed certain benefits of certain change processes, and the others are still not. Overnight change, obviously you can see all of the problems, you can have the strongest fears, factors of resistance are going to be at their max, but often if you're on a tight time frame, there are less risk to not get to completion. So as you see, there's no real easy solution. None of the formats really are offering you sort of a win-win scenario. So it's often a case of judging this in a context. So you're going to have to look at this in terms of the context that you're envisaging for your case study. But often, again, supporting people for that is going to be creating a communication strategy that explains what choices you make, then supporting people through the format of change that you've chosen, and then making sure that it leads to completion and that you monitor the results and that you lead that process all the way. Another thing, I don't want the video to be too long, it's just supposed to be a conversation stuff, but another thing I'd like you to possibly explore, it's growth mindset. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of literature around growth mindset. It's interesting here because it's at the intersection of leadership style and management of change. So it sort of overlaps what we discussed last week in terms of leadership styles and what we're discussing this time in terms of management of change. The first reason for this is that resistance is not a phenomenon that's limited to employees. So we've so far discussed factors of resistance within your team, but we as leaders sometimes are also affected by factors of resistance. So growth mindset is going to be useful in creating self-reflection, examining why we yourself as leaders may be reticent to make certain choices and to move forward, and to allow us maybe some growth in terms of how we can move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So moving from fears to moving to more adventurous or more sort of proactive situations. The other thing that's important is that when you've looked at leadership style, you probably see that certain leadership style conceptually are very interesting, particularly if you see the whole historical progression towards transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is one that's very prevalent at the moment, prominent in literature. In many environments, we're saying this is what we should all be aiming for, because obviously it works with intrinsic motivation of employees, it's inspirational, creates the best work environment, makes organization move fast, both with great interpersonal relationship, but also towards a clear vision. So obviously it's very appealing. But as you've probably seen, transformational leadership requires some very specific skills from a leader. You have to be inspirational. You have to be an extremely good communicator. You have to be able to share your vision with your team and actually tap into that intrinsic motivation. It takes very specific skills. So growth mindset is also useful in the sense that sometimes we see, and I see this often in leadership courses, students who say, I'm really attracted by this leadership style, but I don't know how to get there, and it doesn't align with my personality. I may be an introvert. I don't feel particularly inspirational. I don't necessarily have communication capacities to actually speak to a whole organization in that sort of format. So people may be attracted to a certain leadership style, such as transformational, but feel they don't have the skills to really make it part of the daily reality. So growth mindset is also interesting there in the sense that I think it reconciles some of the self-reflection people do on themselves in terms of personality as a leader, and some of the goals that they have in terms of growth, and in terms of which leadership styles are they aiming for. So have a look, because it may be interesting too, because I think it's very easy in technology integration to look at, for example, transformation leadership and say, this would be great, this would work well, this is exactly what you need. But it's also very common for leaders to sit back and say, I'm not a transformational leadership, not innately, not naturally. And so how am I ever going to get there? Or am I going to be stuck in this sort of split personality issue where I'm supposed to be something at work, but I'm not that on the outside? And then how stressful does that become when I have sort of two personality, one that I put on for work and one that I have naturally? So I think growth mindset is really useful there as well, in sort of looking at leadership skills, not as something static, but something that we work towards. And so that might be something you want to also embed and integrate into your reflection for your assignment. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to post that now. And I think we have a pub night coming up. I have to check on which day it is. So we'll be able to discuss some of this as well. The pub night will be for you to present all of the questions that you have. It might be about the last assignment. It might be about leadership. It might be about management of change. I'm not going to fix a specific agenda, but just bring all your questions, and then we'll be able to talk about all that together. So I will speak to you very soon. And again, have a great Canada Day. Bye for now.